Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Plattwoods Church, both here and those of you worshiping with us online. My name is Evie Martin. I'm the lead pastor here. It's great to be worshiping together. I have two kids. They are currently 13 and 9. Yeah, that's our Christmas picture. It's great. 14 years ago, as I was preparing for this first baby to enter into our world, I was gifted a book, a classic, a shelf standard for expectant parents of the last few generations. Any guesses as to the book? We don't even need the slide. Right? I was like, what to expect when you're expecting? Fantastic. I am a person who likes to be prepared. I will follow instructions. When it comes to scary things, I will do what people who have done it before me tell me to do. I was happy to be in the know and to excel at this birthing and parenting thing. I was determined to get it right by the book. A question worth asking me at this point is, Evie, did you read the book? 14 years and another whole kid later, the answer is no, I did not read the book. I read a little bit of the book. I consulted the book a handful of times with kid number 1. Do I even know where the book is now? I do not. Probably out there, somewhere in the universe, giving another expectant mother an equally false sense of security and self-confidence as she prepares for this blissful life of parenting. In no way do I mean to discredit or dismiss the expert work of the co-authors of What to Expect When You're Expecting. It is a standard for a reason. But I do mean to be honest about my own relationship with expectations. They can be both a blessing and a curse. Expectations, in moderation, can keep you sane. They can normalize an experience to remind you that you are not the first or only person ever to take on a particular task or challenge. They can keep us on track, on target, focused on a goal, prepared for what might happen. They can keep us from panicking in a crisis if we realize that the circumstance was anticipated and the problem solvable. Expectations are not categorically bad. But every single person in this room knows what else expectations can do. They can prescribe a reality for us that may not go exactly the way we think. They can hold up a standard or a norm that is unlikely to be met. They cannot account for every circumstance we will encounter in this life because every single variable of every single day is unpredictable. Expectations can lead to disappointment. Expectations can even turn into resentment. And when we find ourselves there, we know it's time to let those expectations go. This month, we have begun the season of Lent, a time of 40 days that prepare us for Easter. It's usually observed as a season of simplicity, of spiritual reflection, soul searching even. It's a time when we try to minimize external distractions and focus on what is going on within us and how God might be at work. Traditionally then, Christians throughout the world mark Lent by fasting, by giving up certain indulgences or habits, vices even, to redirect their attention to their hunger for God, not for temporal things. It is a time to let stuff go. So this sermon series speaks to that spiritual work. And while you may or may not have let go of social media or sweets or cussing or gossiping for these 6 weeks, here at Plattwoods, we're trying to let some other stuff go too. Through stories from Jesus' own ministry, from his example, we're considering each week some of the things that keep people from Jesus and the life that God has for us. Some of the big things that we really need to let go. Last week we began with let that control go. Jesus' temptation in the wilderness shows us that the things we would like to control show us something of our values. They tell us what we really care about. And so rather than try to take control of them, we can take care instead. This week, we will learn from both Abraham in the Old Testament and Nicodemus in the Gospel of John how expectations can get in our way and when it's time to let go of those too. We'll start in reverse. We'll start with Nicodemus and his encounter with Jesus. So as we jump into his story, listen, as you're listening, try to hear maybe some of the layers of expectations that are at work here. You have to listen deeply, but hear from John, the Gospel of John, chapter 3. There was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a Jewish leader. He came to Jesus at night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could do these miraculous signs that you do unless God is with him." Jesus answered, "I assure you, unless someone is born anew, it's not possible to see God's kingdom." Nicodemus asked, "How is it possible for an adult to be born? It's impossible to enter the mother's womb for a second time and be born, isn't it?" Jesus answered, "I assure you, unless someone is born of water and the Spirit, it's not possible to enter God's kingdom. Whatever is born of the flesh is flesh, and whatever is born of the Spirit is spirit. Don't be surprised that I said to you, you must be born anew. God's Spirit blows wherever it wishes. You hear its sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it's going. It's the same with everyone who is born of the Spirit." Nicodemus said, "How are these things possible?" I see expectations at work in Nicodemus' story right off the bat. The first thing to note is when Nicodemus comes to find Jesus. He comes looking for him at night. We know that Nicodemus is a Pharisee, a Jewish leader. He holds a position of authority in his community with a certain image and decorum that comes with it. But also, he's not the only Pharisee. He belongs to a certain echelon of his peers. And as with any old boys club, it is in this case an old boys club, there are unspoken rules and expectations. One does not simply talk to peasant rabbis. One does not simply acknowledge uncertainty. How are these things possible? One does not simply ask questions when you are the answer man. Nicodemus sneaks out at night because other people's expectations of him as a leader, as a holy man, as someone who answers questions, doesn't ask them, keep him bound to a certain image and persona. He doesn't want anyone to see what's going on in his heart and his mind about this Jesus person and what God might be up to here. Other people's expectations are crippling to Nicodemus. We know they are crippling to us too. But we see Nicodemus get tangled up in another set of expectations too. He has devoted his life to the study and the upholding of the law of the people of Israel. His heart and his mind are steeped in the stories, the sayings, the statutes that make up sacred scripture. He has crystallized his understanding of who God is and what God will do for God's people. And so in his conversation with Jesus, we see him get trapped in his expectations of outcomes. He begins with what feels like such eager curiosity. "Rabbi, we know you are from God. There's no explanation for these things that you're doing." It feels like it's about to be a really incredible conversion story. The Pharisee becoming the follower, not the leader. He wants to know. He wants to understand more. And Jesus knows he's asking to see more. So he tells him he must be born all over again. So quickly then, in that moment, we see Nicodemus' old instincts kick back in. He knows how the world works. He cannot be born again. He shrinks back from this realm of the spirit he's almost stepped into the reality of biological process. An adult cannot enter his mother's womb a second time, he says. I think he knows this is not what Jesus means. But I think that conversation moved so quickly, moved him toward an outcome and a future that he did not expect and he does not understand, that he starts to backpedal to keep the conversation grounded in what he knows. And I think it's interesting that Jesus' answer back to him makes it clear that whatever it is he thinks he knows, whatever Nicodemus is certain of or expects that God will do, that's not it. He will have to erase his programming, his expectations shaped over decades of life and study, be born as a blank slate all over again in order to see this kingdom that God is building. Its outcome cannot be predicted, Jesus says. It cannot be mapped or monitored. God's Spirit blows wherever it wishes. You hear its sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it's going. It's the same with everyone who is born of the Spirit. God does not work the way you think God works, and never will. Take God out of the box, Nicodemus. Nicodemus' last words in this conversation are, "How can this be possible?" His understanding, his knowledge, his vision of God that has brought him to this prestigious point in his life that people rely on him to uphold is off. His expectation of who God is and how God has moved, is moving, and will move in the world is too small, and he's trapped by it. He can't see what Jesus is saying to him. It's no coincidence then that Jesus goes on to talk about those who remain in the dark. When did Nicodemus come? At night. They cannot see because they love the darkness more than the light. And we catch a glimpse of the expectation Nicodemus must have had about God's outcomes for the world, what many people's expectations of God probably still are today. Later in verse 17, Jesus says, God didn't send his son into the world to judge, other words that word means judge or punish, condemn, or decide the fate of the world. This is the expectation that Jesus is trying to break down. This is what people believe about God, God's character, God's action, God's relationship to humankind. God didn't send me here to do that, he said. God sent me here to do this, but that the world might be saved or healed, rescued, preserved through him. Humans expected one outcome: judgment, punishment, condemnation. Jesus is here to tell us there's something else. It would be good to let go of what was expected. The trade-off from punishment to healing is a good one. It seems like God may have a bigger and better plan than what we can imagine or expect. But Nicodemus, and probably also our expectations, hold us back from God. If we rewind the tape a couple millennia from Nicodemus, we meet Abram. Abram is a man who worships God before the people of Israel even have a name or a place or a promise. So he has no preconceived notions of what God can or should do. And so when God comes with an invitation and a remarkable promise, Abram has no expectations in his way. From Genesis chapter 12, the Lord said to Abram, "Leave your land, your family, and your father's household for the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name respected. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will be blessed because of you." Abram left, just as the Lord told him, and Lot, his nephew, went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. This is the beginning of Abram's story. God says, get up and go. Leave everything and everyone you know and go. God doesn't say where. God just says, to the land that I will show you. And Abram gets up and goes. He is willing and eager. Expectations do not keep him from God's invitation. Not yet. But the second part of that conversation comes to haunt him over the years. God had made him a promise that Abram would bless all the families of the earth, that he would be the forebear of a great nation. And as the decades pass and no children are born to Abram and Sarah, his wife, he starts to realize that he did have some expectations after all, and they remain unmet. The resentment starts to set in. This promise of God is turning out to be a disappointment. We fast forward a few chapters and many years to Genesis 15, where Abram and God are having another chat, and Abram says, hey, about that thing you said, I don't see how I'm gonna bless the families of the earth since I don't even have my own family, so I'm gonna help you out, God, by making my servant my heir, and then his kids will be my kids, and I can go ahead and be that blessing like you said. God sits him down under the stars and says, no, not like that. You can't see what I can see. You will have as many descendants as there are stars up above you. Okay, Abram says, and waits again. Still nothing. So a few years later, he and his maidservant have a kid together, and he's like, cool, this one will work. God steps in again and says, no, not like that. That's not what I'm doing. I promise, I'm making you the ancestor of many nations. Your wife will have a son. At this point, Abraham, age 99, and he got a new syllable in his name during that last convo with God, he lies down on the ground and laughs. When his wife Sarah, age 90, hears the same story, she also laughs. And then she gets pregnant and has a baby. And from that baby comes another baby named Jacob, who becomes known as Israel. And from that baby come 12 more babies who become 12 tribes. And all of a sudden, before you know it, Abraham is the father of many nations. I don't think Abraham and Sarah got a copy of what to expect when you're expecting. I'm not sure it would have helped anyway. But here again, in Abraham's story, while we see him at first unbound by expectations, leaving home with no destination in mind, over time, his own imagination and foresight starts to take over this covenant God has made with him. He becomes tied to his own expectations of how things will play out. And never are his ideas as interesting as God's. We humans are creatures whose entire lives are shaped by expectations. As we've said, the moment a child is conceived, we call the mother expectant. When we get into school, our progress is measured by categories of expectation: exceeds expectation, meets expectation, does not meet expectation. Our job performance is measured in similar ways. I can't tell you how many of my peers I talk to in midlife who say, well, here I am in my 40s and my life is nothing like I expected. And usually they don't mean it has exceeded expectation. Folks in retirement often share this same sentiment when health or life circumstances have reshaped the way they thought things would be. And so, when so many things in our human lives and relationships are built around and measured with language of expectation, we can hardly help but put expectations on our experience and relationship with the divine as well. But what I think we see from Nicodemus and Abraham both are three problems that those expectations create for us when we hold on too tightly. First, our expectations confine us to our own imaginations. If we can't conceive of it, it can't happen. We lock in the outcomes that we think are possible and that we would like to see, and we set our minds on that future. This was where Nicodemus got stuck, and he couldn't let go of the future he had constructed in order to participate the one that God was actually creating, the one that was made out of love. Humans have incredible imaginations, for sure. They shrink as we get older, but they are still powerful. And yet, they are finite, and they are singular. We can only expect within the limits of what we can imagine. And what we can imagine then limits what we think God can do. Like Nicodemus, if we can't let our expectations go, we can't step out of the dark to follow where Jesus is going. The second problem is that expectations keep us stuck in the future. Thinking about the future isn't bad. Planning for it is a uniquely human trait. But expectations are always about things that are going to happen, not things that are happening now. And so they always remain out in front of us, like a carrot in front of a horse. Abraham is so fixated on the results that he expects God to deliver that twice he tries to manifest those results himself, ends up hurting a lot of people in the process. Expectations in our own lives can hurt a lot of people too. We're so fixated on how something might be or could be, how our kids will turn out one day, how our spouse will eventually change the behaviors that annoy us, when that career step will finally manifest. We're living with our minds in the future and we're missing what is going on right around us right now. And a third problem is that expectations leave us disappointed. Nicodemus, living with his own expectations instead of the reality that Jesus was laying out before him, chose the life he knew and could understand. I think ultimately he was disappointed with his choice because we see him 2 more times in Jesus' story. Once, he speaks up to defend Jesus in front of the other Pharisees. And at the end, he brings spices and ointments for Jesus' burial. Those actions seem to hint that a deep part of him longed for something more as he continued to watch Jesus in his ministry from a distance. He couldn't let go of his own expectations, but they had let him down. There's a solution to all 3 of these problems. The solution is letting our expectations go and exchanging them for hope. Expectations and hope are a lot alike, but they are distinct in important ways. While expectations bind us to the outcomes we've imagined or the ones we deem important, hope frees us to revel, to rejoice in the present, and to look to what God is really doing. Expectations are centered on us. We create them. Our imaginations limit them. We convince ourselves that they are the best outcomes possible for us. Hope, on the other hand, is centered on God. God imagines far beyond what our finite minds can. God breaks out of every box we can ever conceive. We don't have to have all or any of it figured out. And while expectations have us trusting in the results, hope has us trusting in the process. If God is at work in it, we can trust that work. We don't have to be able to see the outcome. We can marvel at, dare I say, enjoy the process. Letting go of expectations and taking hold of hope transforms each of those problems that our expectations create. Rather than being confined to our own imaginations, hope opens up possibilities beyond our wildest dreams. The outcomes do not depend on us. God has something much better in mind. Letting go of expectations frees us from being stuck in the future, and it plants us firmly in the present. When we're not so preoccupied with outcomes the way we think they should be, we can pay attention to the work God is doing in our lives and through people right now and all around us. And we can find deep joy, even in the midst of suffering, because we are present here. Letting go of expectations and taking hold of hope puts disappointment behind us, and it opens us up instead to surprise, to see God's outcomes in ways we never dreamed were possible, to see nations born and blessed through a woman at 90, to see a man heal the sick with his hands and his word, to see him feed 5,000 people, to see him die, lay in the ground, disappointment knocking at the front door, and to hear news 3 days later that his tomb was empty and he lived again. Hope opens us to surprise. Expectations will always be at work in our lives. They are the water we all swim in. But when expectations run our lives, especially our spiritual lives, when they hold us back from stepping into what God is doing, when they keep us from walking to follow the Spirit, which blows where it will, when our expectations delude us into thinking that we have the best way forward, that what we see for ourselves, for others, for the future is what God must have in mind, then we have it backwards. We have it wrong. We will remain bound and stuck and disappointed. But if we can release our expectations and take on hope, we will be free, we will be present, we will be surprised by God. We can let those expectations go. Will you pray with me? God of the past, the present, and the future, for all the outcomes we try to prescribe, for all the ways we think we know best, for all the expectations we cling to, forgive us. Center our hearts on you, not on ourselves. Ground us in the present, where you are steadily at work. Surprise us always with a future that we could never imagine. In the name of Jesus, whose Spirit moves where it will and bids us follow. Amen.